Morning everyone, welcome to our Soundbite Monday as we continue our journey through the book of Ruth. And today we're looking at Ruth chapter 3, so let me read it to you. One day, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you, where you'll be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes, then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go, uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," said Ruth. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are my kinsman redeemer." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognised. And he said, "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you're wearing and hold it out." And she did so, and he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" And then she told him everything Boaz had done for her, and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You know, our society has become obsessed with the extraordinary, with situations and events that seem rather extreme or bizarre. You only have to watch daytime TV or trawl the internet to get that sort of weird and extreme experience or behaviour. You know, somebody who's been kept in a goldfish bowl by aliens, or who wants to dress up as a stick of celery and bathe in a bath of mayonnaise. But obsession with the bizarre has meant that too often we don't celebrate what is the normal experience of life. How many people do you know with a steady middle-class job and a stable family that's ever been featured on TV or on YouTube or on a soap opera? The same trend is also there in the Christian world, though. For some, the Christian life is supposed to be full of extraordinary, full of miracles, amazing events. And we read about Christians in whom God did amazing things, calling them as missionaries, answering powerful prayers. Which is great to hear, because our God does do amazing things and answer powerful prayers. But he doesn't work that way most of the time. So we need help to understand how God works in our normal life experiences through faith, as well as in those extraordinary providences that God allows. And that's what this book of Ruth is here to show us. Remember back in chapter 1, Naomi returned from Moab after that triple bereavement of her husband and 2 sons, desolate, poor, bitter, despite being accompanied by Ruth, her son's widowed Moabite wife. Naomi didn't lose faith that God was sovereign, but she certainly didn't see great miracles in her tragedy. Her prayers seemed to have come back to her empty, she said. And then we saw in chapter 2 how faith was lived out in the normal circumstances of life. Ruth modelled to us the normal experience of faith in adversity. She didn't sit back in despair, but motivated by love for her mother-in-law, she showed both godly humility and practical hard work to glean the fields for food. And God extended his providence to her. in the God incidents that she ends up gleaning in Boaz's field, who is both a close relative and a committed believer. And then Boaz models to us the normal experience of faith in security and stability. He was wealthy, a man of property, he had slaves, yet he was faithful to God's commands in allowing Ruth to glean his fields, as God's law required. But more than that, he was generous in fulfilling what God asks, going far beyond the letter of the law and showing a grace that reflects God's attitude to us. So two people who are trusting God's providence, that he's in charge of everything and will supply what's needed. Yet they don't see any great miracles or spectacular answers to their prayers. Rather, they experience God's sovereign control through the God incidences that bring the right people together at the right time in a way that's answering their prayers and desires, but actually in a way that they didn't even anticipate. So despite the hard work of Ruth and the generous grace of Boaz, Ruth and Naomi, as we enter chapter 3, are still far from being rescued from the pressures they are under. They've got no income, no home. There were no social security safety nets in those days for widows. Despite the God incidences of God's providence in answer to their prayers, they still haven't found the long-term solution to their problems. They've got food for today, but no future ahead of them. And you can only glean the food for food in the fields during harvest time. What's going to happen when the food runs out? So chapter 3 is here to show us how to respond in faith and prayer to the providence of God into those normal pressures of life. How will God normally guide our lives if we live by faith? Well, the first principle is in verses 1 to 6, because Naomi shows us that we are to be proactive, not passive in our attitude. To be proactive, not passive. Naomi is actually the one who saw God's hand at work in the field that Ruth was gleaning. How did she know it was the Lord and not a coincidence? Well, perhaps she realised it because she realised who Boaz was. You know, chapter 2, verse 20, it said, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. In Naomi's eyes, God had not just provided a generous farmer who helped them to eat, God provided them with a hope of an even greater future. But there's still a near insurmountable problem to be overcome. A kinsman redeemer would only be of help if there was a male heir in Naomi's family. Two widows were still in the mess because they had no male heir. See, in the Old Testament law, it's the Lord who is the ultimate owner of the land, and the Israelites are only his tenants. So the law commands that the land should never permanently be taken from a particular family. For example, if someone became poor and the land had to be sold, any sale was not intended to be permanent. Every 50 years, the land that had been sold returned to the original owner without charge in the Jubilee. In effect, the land itself wasn't being sold, rather the harvest that the land brought was sold for so many years. However, in the case of poor people, it was commanded that where land had been sold, the closest relative who could afford to should buy back the land on behalf of the poor family. And the person who did that was called the kinsman redeemer. Boaz was related to Naomi's dead husband, and as such he qualified to buy back the land for Elimelech and his heirs. However, there's the problem. Boaz can only redeem the land for the heirs of Elimelech, and there aren't any. Yet. So what did God's law command if there were no male heirs? The law said if a man dies childless, his brother or close relative should marry the widow, and the first child of the new marriage would be reckoned as the heir of the original brother. That was the law that the Sadducees tried to catch Jesus out with the story of the 7 brothers who all ended up marrying the same woman. So Ruth and Naomi need somebody willing to fulfill God's law to provide them, first with an heir, and then somebody willing to fulfill the law to be a redeemer to buy back their land so that they can be provided for. So Naomi here is trusting the God incident that meeting Boaz is a sign that God is going to provide that dual hope through him. And rather than sit back and see what happens, she takes the initiative. She tells Ruth to privately approach Boaz to see whether he might take responsibility, not only to redeem the land for Elimelech's family, but also to provide the heir necessary through marrying Ruth. There was no obligation on him to do either. But Ruth trusts that God's providence is at work and her prayers will lead to these great possibilities. You see, the normal experience of God working in our lives is not merely something that happens when we're passive, but when we step out in faith, when we're proactive in what we think may be the will of God. Our prayers and the providence of God opens the door for unexpected possibilities then. For example, I hope it's your passionate desire for your relatives and friends to become Christians. And I hope that you pray for that regularly. But Naomi is in a sense showing us that our normal experience of God's providence is not just to pray for God to work in them, but to proactively and actually ask our friends and family to come to church with us, or to study the Bible with us, or to join Alpha or Christianity Explored. It's when we act out of trust in God's power to do what we like to do that he is glorified in us. It's his strength and our weakness, but we take that step. And that's the normal Christian experience. Not big miracles, but actions blessed by God. Naomi teaches us to be proactive, not passive. But in verses 7 to 15 in chapter 3, it's Ruth who teaches us to be pure and not manipulative in our behaviour. Because the whole story in the original is gloriously ambiguous, of how Ruth goes in the twilight to find Boaz guarding the newly threshed barley and lying at his feet until he awakes and finds her there. And then she asks him to act as her redeemer and to take responsibility for her, and Boaz is won over by her grace and humility. But the whole story is deliberately couched in suggestive language. It's a great story. Ruth was told to uncover Boaz's feet while he was asleep, and she literally, that's all she did. But at that time, uncovering somebody's feet was also a euphemism for uncovering their private parts. It could have been a come on. And then it says she lies with him until morning. Well, again, literally, that's all she does. But that lying with somebody, of course, is another euphemism for sex. See, the double entendres are given to be deliberate because the situation could have so easily be handled differently, impurely. Ruth would have had far more bargaining power over Boaz if she had slept with him, particularly if he got her pregnant. In fact, as a Moabitess, her forefather, Moab, if you know the story, had been born after her mother had committed incest with Lot after getting him drunk. So it's recognising how unlike her forefather's Ruth is. She's not like a Moabite anymore. What's striking is that both Ruth and Boaz maintain absolute purity in their behaviour. Neither exploits nor manipulates the other to fix the situation. Ruth models for us the proactive approach of doing God's will that never compromises God's way. Do God's will, but don't compromise God's way. And it's that purity and innocence that Boaz finds so attractive in verse 10. The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. Boaz recognises that Ruth was desirable and could perhaps have made money from illicit relationships with others, but she hadn't. She'd maintained an integrity and purity that demonstrated that she really did trust the Lord to take care of her. For those who trust a sovereign God, the ends never justify the means, because God knows our hearts and sees our secrets. A belief in the sovereign providence of God means, therefore, making sure that our motives and our actions are pure. Take initiative, yes, but don't manipulate on the way, because we recognise our accountability is to God and not men. Which is why we need to be very careful never to deceive those who we're sharing our faith with. I know people who've been invited to Christian events under false pretenses. Oh, we're just having a meal together, and then there's some speaker speaking about things. So not only was the gospel a challenge, they had the issue of embarrassment and awkwardness of being there under false pretenses. So you can't do that to people. It doesn't honour the God who we serve. So never use deceptive means to achieve your ends, even if you think they're good ends. If we're proactive in God's service, he promises he will do his will through us. He doesn't need our deceptions to help him. So despite the risks, despite the opportunities for Ruth and Boaz to overstep the mark of God's law, They don't. In purity and honesty they find love. And that's where the last verses also teach us, from Boaz's example, to be loving and not legalistic in our motivation. To be loving, not legalistic. You see, in all that's happened so far, there's nothing that has put Boaz under any obligation at all. He was a kinsman redeemer, but there were no male relatives for whom he has to redeem the land, so he had no obligation to act. He was a near relative, but not close enough to be required to marry Ruth and continue the family line. Indeed, at the end of the day, the law actually forbade the intermarriage of Jew and Moabites. So even though Naomi's son had already broken that law, Boaz could have had grounds to say, well, I can avoid that responsibility. But that's where the depth of grace and trust in God is seen. He acts to resolve the impasse, despite there being another closer kinsman redeemer than he was, and he acts to resolve it immediately to see whether or not that kinsman redeemer would act or not. That's verse 13. And his generosity continues because he sends Ruth away, literally heavy laden with food for Naomi. And so Boaz shows us the critical principles for our normal experience of God working in our lives. That is, of having a motivation of love rather than legalism in what we do. Boaz had all sorts of reasonable and legal ways of getting out of doing anything for Ruth and Naomi. But instead of following the letter of the law, he understands that God gave the law in the right context to set the right context for love. What Boaz shows is grace, undeserved love. And to Ruth and Naomi, because he does more than what was required to meet their needs. Obviously that love motivation is now especially focused on Ruth, but it's in loving her that Boaz is enabled to do the will of God. You see, when Jesus summed up what God expects of us, he did it in a command for a wholehearted love for God and an unreserved love for others. But there's the recognition of God at work, because how can you ever command people to love? You know, I could say to you, excuse me, I want you to love me. But commanding it doesn't make it happen. No, you see, a love for God and for others is only possible when God is doing the loving through us. When the love he already has for that person infects the way that we see them, because we see them through his eyes, not our own. And that's when he's at work by his extraordinary sovereign providence. The normal Christian experience here is extraordinary. Not because we see amazing miracles of God's power for us, but because we experience a deeper motivation of God's love in us. He changes our hearts. That's the biggest and greatest challenge of all. And that's what happens in the normal Christian life. He moves us to love. And only God can give us a love that goes beyond our friends and acquaintances to reach those whom he loves. If you want to experience God working in your life in the most powerful way, be proactive and pure in loving others. It's when we have a genuine love for people that our actions will be seen by them as the sovereign work of God through us. And that's the challenge of normal Christian living. Not just being proactive in walking in God's will or being pure in our behaviour towards others. Those are tall orders in themselves. But the challenge that Boaz and Ruth gives us is that which is to be part of our normal experience of the providence of God each day, is being motivated by love for others in our relationship to them. To see our heart's desire to bless them as the reason to serve. So God works powerfully, you see, when his people are proactive in faith, pure in their life, and loving in their motive. And Ruth, Boaz and Naomi are only just beginning to realise how powerful that faithfulness will be, because by the end of chapter 3, we've still resolved nothing. Except Boaz has a new resolve. He has a new heart to sort this. He isn't confirmed yet as the Redeemer or as the suitor, because despite the power of God's providence bringing the two of them together, he hasn't got there yet. But he does have the resolve to act. He has the integrity that maintains honour, and he has a heart that betrays a growing love. And that combination bears fruit in the providence of God. And Naomi's last word is, "You wait, my daughter, until you see what happens, for the man won't rest till the matter's settled today." Well, you're going to have to wait to see how it gets sorted next week. But thanks for listening, and may God bless you with his providence in those normal experiences of Christian living. Thank you.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me, his word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shine